Afternoon. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. The very first item on our work session is a proclamation, Forget-Me-Not Month. We have James J.R. Arnold here from Disabled American Veterans, Chapter 14, to accept the proclamation. All right, the proclamation for Forget-Me-Not Month, September 2017, goes as follows. Whereas the Disabled American Veterans Organization offers a variety of free services to disabled veterans and their families. And whereas each year, the Disabled American Veterans Organization holds Forget-Me-Not Drive, where all proceeds raised are given to those disabled veterans and their families who are in need. And whereas the City of Hagerstown expresses their gratitude to those disabled veterans who valiantly fought to protect our freedom and preserve our way of life. Now, therefore, be it resolved with the support of the City Council, I, Robert E. Bruce II, Mayor of the City of Hagerstown, Maryland, do hereby proclaim the month of September 2017 as Forget-Me-Not Month and encourage our citizens to support the Forget-Me-Not Drive, which supports our local disabled veterans and their families.
Thank you very much.
JR, thank you very much. I'll give you that. She's going to get a picture.
I guess I should turn around here.
I'm going to get my glasses off. She always takes them.
All right, right here. 3. 1, 2, 3.
See if she works.
I'd just like to let everybody know that everything we collect goes back to the veterans, and we take nothing for ourselves. We're one of the few organizations that doesn't even have anybody in. Right now, I'm the commander, and I get absolutely nothing. And we don't want anything because we're taking care of our brothers. I have a shirt that says, "Don't thank me," and on the back it says, "Thank my brothers who didn't come back." And there's quite a few that didn't come back, you know. But that's basically it.
Thank you, buddy.
Okay?
Appreciate all you do. Thanks, Chair.
Thank
I got to leave and go with you.
Michelle, looks like you're up for the fund balance retained earnings policy.
Yes. Hello, good afternoon. Hello. So one of the many things that we look at, of course, very often and talk about very often is the whole concept of fund balance. And what is fund balance? The fund balance basically is the cumulative impact of how an organization has performed since we've been in creation or since we have existed. And so for a policy that is so important and helps ensure the sustainability of an organization, and we look, and Valerie, one of the first things she wanted to look at was the policy. And I said, well, pretty much what's in the budget book and what's on the website is it. And in the packet, I presented a brief memo, and then the very first attachment was the current City of Hagerstown General Fund balance / retained earnings policy. And it's literally just numbered, and it has 3 numbers and 3 lines. And we are always commended whenever we do bond issues with our rating agencies that we do, in fact, have a policy in place and that we do, in fact, make sure that we are meeting and actually exceeding it. Our current policy basically is just for our general fund and states that we will keep 10% in reserves in general fund balance. So in looking at this, and again, it's been in place since August of 1993, and looking at where we are as an organization, the City of Hagerstown isn't just a general fund. We have other funds. So one of the first things that we wanted to do was change this policy to incorporate our other funds, while at the same time recognizing the importance of our general fund. And really and truly in today's standards with where we currently stand with expenses and obligations, 10% is good, and it's a good starting place, but it definitely isn't best standards and best practices. The city of Hagerstown is a little over 23%, and we've been in about the 20 to 23% range for at least the last 5 to 7 years. So we looked at and are recommending in the new policy that our unassigned general fund balance would be at 17%, and that was GFOA best practices a few years ago. Personally, I would like to see it a little higher and higher in our policy to be almost where we've been running the last 5 to 7 years, but also acknowledging that there's times and situations where we'd want to be able to utilize that. So we drafted a policy. It's in 3 short sections. First section is general fund, a section for enterprise funds, and the very last touches upon the health insurance fund. For the general fund, want to acknowledge and look at some of the other ratios that we do review and incorporate it into our CAFR, and that's this whole concept of, 17%. Okay, so really what does that mean? When we look at our current annual operating expenses within the general fund, and it's a little over 40 million, and we say, okay, if something were to happen and we got no additional revenue, how long or how many months could we sustain on what's in that fund balance or in our savings? And right now it's a little over 2 months, almost 2.5. And so when looking at updating and incorporating, just a stronger policy, we really feel like it's something that we talked about with both of the rating agencies. Yes. Actually, it was something that I talked about briefly a couple months ago with Councilmember Alshire as he was looking to do a fund balance policy. And is the other side of that equation that we need to incorporate. So we added general fund. We are recommending at this point that we change our current policy from 10% to 17%, but also within the policy incorporate this concept of we need to acknowledge and look at how much we have in our reserves and how much is available on actual spend if something were to happen. There was just a little sentence or two, if something were to occur and we ever decided to utilize general fund balance reserves and we got below this percentage, then what? Well, then what we would do is we would sit here at this table with this group and we would find a way and strive to incorporate within a 5-year budget period to get back to 17%. Because if something phenomenal comes along and we need to utilize it, we want to be able to do that. But we also know that trying to utilize it for a special item that would come along and also put all that money back all within the same year isn't going to happen. You need time to plan and make sure that it gets back to that level. So we've incorporated under 2A a little bit for that. Our enterprise funds, we already have a separate enterprise fund dividend policy. Within that policy, we have outlined certain criteria where we want their revenue to be, how many months of expenses we want them to have in their reserves and in their cash reserves, not even fund balance. And then we also talk about this concept of the 3 R's and allow them to have some additional reserves that are a little bit more restricted for renovation costs. So it is small because we already felt like we had items in place for it, and pretty much the wording, the little paragraph that we've added, refers back to that dividend policy specifically on that criteria. We don't want to incorporate a new policy, add language for them, and have them be not congruent and saying the same thing. And then last but not least is the concept of our health insurance fund. And one of the reasons we want to incorporate this is because we recognize, in the current fiscal year 18 budget, I had actually proposed to this group that we utilize some surplus fund balance that was sitting in that fund and to actually take it and reallocate a portion, which was fiscal year 16 surplus, back to the funds that had actually allocated revenues to there and put that back in the same way, percentage-wise, that we had allocated it out. So wanted to incorporate language there, again, with it is a little bit different than our other funds because it is by far a little more tricky because we are self-insured. We never know from 1 month, we're in August right now, so we could say July and August of this year started out really good, we're looking great, but we never know until medical claims actually occur and happen if we're going to have, a year that the claims exceed what we thought and eat up our revenue. So we have to wait until the end of the year. So for it, I'm recommending that we keep a little bit more of a minimum, 3.5 months for operating expenses there, because if we get through a year and we spend all the money and we need something in the health insurance fund, where's it going to come from? It's going to come from 50% out of the general fund and the rest out of the others. That would be a big hit for the general fund to incur in the midst of a year. So really feel like we need to leave a little bit more of a reserve and a little bit better guarantee there so that we're not in the midst of a year and having to look at making unexpected.
What was the percentage of the health insurance fund balance prior to allocating some of those funds over?
Fiscal year 18, we were literally, we were a little over the 30% level. We were sitting on a fund balance of about $3 million. Still, and I'm waiting to make that actual transfer and allocation until we finalize our fiscal year 17. We're really close. Excuse me. Waiting on a couple of reports, some lag reports on our health insurance wise to see where we really ended the year so we could finalize
I think
that.
it was a little, was it 31%?
It was higher than 30. It was
Right.
less than 40.
Yeah.
It was definitely more than 3.5 months at the time that I sat here at budget time. But I don't want to give you numbers now because we're
Yeah.
so close with fiscal year 17, and I
Right.
prefer to give you the final audited numbers.
And I think it was important on this particular fund, for its fund balance, that we had these 3 criteria here, A, B, and C, that it needed to at least, we felt comfortable that if it met that,
Yes.
which when we did it this year, it did meet all 3 of these criteria.
Correct.
And we were able to
And would
do
still
that,
leave, we were estimating that it would still leave enough balance even after we did that.
just because of the unknown. 1 month could be devastating, so you have to
Right.
watch that. Yeah.
So really, I mean, to try to summarize changes, I started to do that in my memo, and then I just said to Valerie, I said, you know what? To summarize changes whenever we only had 3 little items listed, and that was our whole policy, is a little hard.
Not to
But-
mention, it was
but basically we
nearly
had a-
25 years old, so it was
Right.
time, yeah.
We had a policy in place, the title literacy added the general fund, so we're recommending that we no longer just recognize the general fund in this policy, that it's important to recognize our other funds. And then on the general fund side, to go from 10% to 17%. Again, we have been at that threshold, at that minimum level for at least the last 5 to 7 years. And also incorporating the number of months minimum of operating expenses, annual operating expenses to have on hand.
And we did a little further defining, especially in section 2A, what is an unplanned emergency situation. We felt we wanted to have a little bit of language there that further defined that as a sudden steep decline in revenue from which no reasonable expenditure reduction or tax rate increase can be planned and implemented in a timely fashion. So that gave us that ability to say, hey, if we need to go below the 17%,
Correct.
hopefully, obviously, that never happens, because that would be something a little bit more drastic, meaning that something was going on, so.
And have reviewed and looked at, many others. There's some states, there was a place within Delaware, there was literally 100%, and I was like, 100%, wow, it was a really nicely written policy, but I'm not sure operationally how they manage that. There are some places that simply don't even have a policy in place at all.
Right.
So again, we recognize, how important it is. Our bond rating agencies always look for it. Our auditors look for it. GFOA looks for it, not only in our budget documentation, but we also report on the ratios and the criteria within our CAFR. We talk about it here. Oftentimes the unions talk about it. This whole concept of fund balance and,
Right.
What can we utilize it for?
Do you have our general fund balance number tonight, of where we're at right
For
now?
17? No, but I don't anticipate it's going to fall below 22%. I was
Do we
hoping,
know what 17% looks like in a number?
I would say between 1.7 and probably 2 million. And again, we're talking when we look at that on the unassigned
You're
portion.
talking about the difference between the 17 and more.
When he's saying 17%, when I say 17%, he wants to know dollar-wise. So that's going to change every year based on how much
And
is
it has to-
actually spent. So
Right.
we're still, I was hoping to be further along. And departments have been very responsive and responding, but we're still receiving many fiscal year 17 items.
To close
Other
out.
than when it would dip below a certain percentage, where then we would agree to put a, 1% back in the next 5 years. How was the general fund reserve generally accumulated?
So each year, last year, we had fiscal year 16, we had a better year. Fiscal year 15, at the end of the year, we look at our total revenue and our total expenses. From there, we have to look at other certain obligations. So when we look at revenue and expenses, that's our change for the current year. So let's say it's $80,000. Let's say our revenue was $80,000 more than our expenses. Well, then the next step that we have to do is we have to look at other items, like how many outstanding purchase orders do we have? How much do we have outstanding in loans? How much do we have on our books for fixed net value of fixed assets? So some of that 80,000, even though it goes to total fund balance, maybe 10,000 is unassigned, maybe 50,000 will go into unassigned. It just depends on how we end the year with other things as well. from
Basically,
year
there's
to
not
year.
a certain percentage each year that automatically goes in, like there would
No,
be if we
it's
fell
just your
below the level.
accumulated, like Michelle said at
Just-
the beginning, it's
just-
the accumulated from the.
Correct.
Right.
Yep.
Your revenue minus your expenses. And so if it's a deficit, your fund balance is going to go down a little bit. If
Yeah.
it's a surplus,
Now-
it's going to go up a little bit.
Right.
Within the last 9 years with having a tax base, it's been,
Flat or declining? Go ahead,
Right.
you
flatly
say it, yeah.
declining. Have we been seeing surpluses within those same years?
The majority, yes. And the reason why is because when we sit down at budget time, we are required when the general fund to always be balanced. So I can't,
No, I understand. I mean, you're looking for
a deficit.
worst-case scenario type
Yes.
situations, things like that, and I get
Right.
that.
So we try, in the years that we know that the revenue is dipping, we really try on the
Expense side.
department and
Right.
expense side then to try to reduce them too. But there have been times within the last 9 years that we've had a loss.
Well, we felt it was important to update the policy as well because, obviously, we were sitting in budget sessions last year. I'm sitting with a 23-year-old, 24-year-old policy, not comfortable with 10%, not wanting to recommend that you can do that, but technically that was your policy.
Right.
So we felt that if we have a policy in place long before we even begin to get into budget discussions, and then you will have a comfort level of what you need to do as well.
But there was also discussions, I guess, during that last budget
Mm-hmm.
cycle, which may or may not come up again, about utilizing some general fund reserve money to ease the burden on, whatever rate may or may not occur.
Right, and we wouldn't want to
This
do it
would kind of
operationally, right.
shrink that potential pool of that money that could be utilized going forward.
Right, but yet give you a level that you could use and be comfortable with using and not risk any kind of
The-
situation with our
The
bond
bond
agencies.
raters and things
Yeah.
that you spoke of, we've gotten favorable ratings with the current levels that we have now.
Right.
Correct?
Correct.
But our current levels are.
Current levels of 23%, basically.
Our current
Correct.
levels are
No.
higher, correct?
6% higher than
Right.
what best practices are, at least through the GFO. Here's my thing. And don't get me wrong. You know how I feel about general fund reserve, and that's the people's money. I mean, that's what it is. And I don't see in the language here about one-time expenditures. Just, like, for example, and it's been our policy, whether written or not, the First Third Grant Program. things like that we would use a one-time expenditure on.
And I think we
See
have
that
that under
number
number 2, where we say, to the extent the unassigned general fund balance exceeds the target at 17%, the city may draw upon these funds to provide pay-go financing for capital projects or for other one-time capital items. So we've tried to incorporate some of the things that we were already doing. Again,
And we didn't want
you
to
know,
get too
17%,
specific, right?
some may say, well, that's a big jump to go from 10% to 17%. Maybe on paper, but the reality of it is that, you know, we've strived very hard and diligently to remain at the current level that we are at, which is above this. So that even if we went to 17%, we don't feel that that would be an undue hardship
Right.
at this point.
Right. In other words, you never managed to 10%. You would never even
No.
recommend managing to 10%. And I'm sure council probably wouldn't even be comfortable with having,
And-
doing that.
And 10% would maybe be half a month's annual operating expenses.
Right.
So a half of a month. So if something happened in 2-week period and we had no additional revenues coming in, we had to pay out bills, that's how long we could do it.
Right.
Just a comment, I attended my first MML conference this summer, and I'm sure Lou could probably agree with me. We tried to attend all the financing and budgeting classes, and they drove home that 17% in every single class consistently, no matter who the instructor was. I mean, they stressed that over and over and over about how that needed to be done for municipalities, so. But on that level, they were already speaking about it as well.
And I think that when you look at the 10% versus the 17%, and the jurisdiction I work for, we're at 30%. And if you look across the nation, you'll find states are going increasingly so to mandating that local governments go to 30%. And part of the reason for that is local governments, you know, when you think of local government and its operations, you might think of it as you know, an employee getting a paycheck, where an employee gets a consistent amount on a consistent schedule and has consistent bills like you do with your home, and that's just not the case. And I think that's what has gotten an increasing number of local jurisdictions in trouble, is they get this sort of, you know, swell of amount from tax revenue or income tax money, shared funds at the beginning of the fiscal year or at the end of the second quarter, and so the funding comes in you know, spurts and lumps at different parts of the year, which are not mirrored with your expenses. So your expenses do function more consistent than your revenue coming in, and so you may say, oh, well, great, you know, we're going to have 17% or 20% of our budgeted amount in the bank at all times, and that's not the case. What this number says is for that fiscal year, you will have at the end of the fiscal year 17% in the bank for that year. But that number fluctuates based on when you're getting the money in and how much expense you have coming out, and the smaller you make that cushion, whether it's you know, the people's money or the city's money, the smaller you make that cushion, the more difficult you make it in terms of being able to cover those larger bills, especially the debt payments that come. You know, so your debt payment comes in May and December, and your big tax influx comes in, you know, September and March. They don't coincide all the time, and one of the things we've looked at with our jurisdiction is trying to make sure that, you know, those peaks and valleys on both sides of that equation, we decrease that what I want to call it, closeness. You know, the scariness that you get to, you're like, okay, I know I got this payment coming in 2 weeks, you know, and when that peak and valley gets too close, you know, or too off on one of them, and you don't have enough cushion, then you will have moments where you go upside down. So I think this number's too low. That's just me. But I also believe that there should be a ceiling.
Lou, anything from you?
I'm fine with the recommendation. I'm also fine with what Kristen says. If there's one place that I would like to think that maybe I have some fiscal conservatism, it's with this particular issue. But I'm fine with 17%.
Well,
To me, I'm okay with internal goal and, you know, trying to keep at those levels as best as possible. As far as policy, which may restrict access for potential reinvestments, or as you say, alluding to the people's money, things like that, that I'm not in favor of. I mean, until we get this whole thing turned around, when we get a positive influx of, tax revenue, we need every dollar that we can get to invest back into this community. And to me, setting a policy like this it restricts the amount that we may be able to utilize. So. And I don't disagree with anything you said, Kristen. I totally agree with understanding levels. In a perfect world, I just don't think we're there right now.
Emily, you're okay at 17 or whatever. I would caution that we wait until all your numbers are in before we adopt a policy for this fiscal year. You said you still have some numbers you're waiting on, and why don't we wait until we get our final report?
Yeah, that's
And
fine. This would just come to you in a motion.
I understand,
Yeah,
I
that's
understand,
fine.
but I'd rather not pass a
Sure.
motion on something that we don't have all our information on yet.
Okay, we could certainly do that.
Okay.
So the CAFR and all of those items are due October 31st, and then our audit team, our auditors, try to come in December to sit before this board to kind of present CAFR and some financial information, but also to report back to you on how myself, my staff, and all of your departments here are operating internally. There's good, adequate control. So you're thinking maybe wait till December or end of October?
October.
I'm thinking probably
Between
end of
October.
October when you get the information that you need,
Okay.
not so much the auditors.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Department of Community and Economic Development Loan Portfolio Update, Jonathan and Ashley Newcomer.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Ashley's passing out a copy of the PowerPoint presentation we prepared this evening for our loan portfolio update. For those that haven't met Ashley, Ashley is our business finance specialist in the Department of Community and Economic Development. She is our point person that assists our loan customers through the loan process from application all the way through loan payment processing. What we will do is go through the presentation, and if there's any questions,
Yes, I'm so sorry. I stopped short, my apologies.
yeah, if there's any questions at the end of the presentation, then we will gladly take those.
Thank you. Thanks, Ashley.
I think they were trying to hide something from me.
Mayor doesn't get one.
Okay, just to start off on the first slide, to talk a little bit about our overall loan portfolio, it's just below about 3.9 million. We have 42 active loans that make up the majority of our portfolio, and 41 deferred loans, about 1 million there. There are no business revolving loans within our deferred loans. It's the majority are, well, they all are CDBG funded single-family rehabilitation program loans. Typically, these are senior citizens or low to moderate income families that we feel that these loans might create, loan payments might create an unnecessary burden. The loans are secured by a mortgage and would become due when the owner passes or the property is sold, but for the most part, they just remain deferred within our portfolio. The active loans are, we'll get into a little bit more detail about each of the loan programs, but they are primarily made up of our public facility and single-family residential, as well as our rental residential and business revolving loans.
And the delinquent loan balance is listed on this pie chart. These are not any, even though we say recent delinquent loans on that sheet, it's actually recent within roughly 5 to 6 years. We haven't had any new loans in the last 2 to 3 years that have become delinquent. These are older carryover loans. We'll highlight carryover delinquent loans that we've had from previous presentations that we'll still discuss here a little bit later in the presentation.
The next slide just goes into a little bit of our loan types. Again, we'll get into a little bit more detail about these programs, but the majority of our loan balances are comprised of our deferred loan balances, which are single-family or public facility, our rental residential program, which provides really low-interest loans to investment property owners, and then our business revolving loans, which has 16 loans within that portfolio. So these percentages are based on the dollar amounts as opposed to the number, but I did list the number next to each of those. A small majority make up commercial, home ownership, and public facility, but the majority are within those ones I listed. We do have just 2 active single-family. Those are loans that they do choose to make payments rather than be deferred, that it doesn't create an unnecessary burden for them.
Yes, and also listed there, CDBG home ownership loans. That is an older practice of our homeownership program where we buy properties with CDBG funds, sell them to homeowners. In the 90s and maybe early 2000s, we actually held the mortgage and were the mortgage processor essentially for those homeowners. We've steered away from that practice, I think, around the mid-2000s when programs such as the Maryland Mortgage Program became popular, and we got out of the mortgage business with those properties. So there's still a handful of those properties that were sold in the 80s and 90s where we're processing mortgage payments, but once again, we went away from that recently, but there are still some older ones that are still on the loan portfolio. So just to go over some of the different loan programs we have, essentially there's 2 different funds. We have the Business Rolling Loan Fund, and then we have the CDBG program. The Business Rolling Loan Fund, I believe, began in 1999, and initially started with local city funds and a mix of state, I believe, Department of Commerce funds that I think were injected into the loan program in the year 2000, long before our time. Yeah, but over time, we have injected additional state funding into the Business Revolving Loan Fund program. This is strictly for business applicants. It's not for any type of residential activity. We've had some new Business Revolving Loan Fund activity in FY17 that we'll highlight a little bit later in the presentation, but loan funds can be used for property acquisition, property rehabilitation, equipment for restaurants or businesses, working capital. Maximum loan amount is $200,000, depending on our loan balance or our available loan funds at any given time. Typically, the interest rate falls around 3%. As of now, as you can see, the available loan funds are down to about $62,000. We, once again, use State of Maryland program funds at times to inject into the program. We're constantly in touch with the gentleman at the Maryland Department of Commerce, so we're having ongoing conversations with that entity to see if there's additional ways to inject loan funds into our program. Then the other side of our loan portfolio would be the CDBG funded programs. We essentially have 2 different programs through the CDBG funds, one for residential rental properties. The other one would be the single-family rehabilitation loans for homeowners that need home repairs. For residential rental loans, it's typically investment owners who would be undertaking significant renovations to a property. Most of the time with the CDBG program, those units that are renovated through this loan program have to be occupied by residents. At least 51% of the units in a project have to be occupied by residents that meet CDBG income guidelines. That's not always the case. There's some other CDBG objectives that we can meet when, say, maybe somebody would buy a vacant building that's been blighted for a number of years. There's other ways to rehab through CDBG that doesn't have that income restriction. But most of the time it does require the income restrictions for the investment properties. The same would be said then for the single-family homeowner CDBG funded loans. Homeowners would have to meet, they have to be current homeowners. They would have to meet the CDBG income guidelines. And once again, loan funds would go to home repairs, general code compliance improvements. A lot of homeowners, sometimes we see folks that need new roofs, new heating systems, painting of the exterior, new windows, new porches. So it's a wide variety of activities through those programs. And sorry, I'm falling behind here on the slideshow on TV. But as we get into FY17 highlights, I'll let Ashley go over this portion of the
Sure,
the
certainly.
presentation.
For FY17, we did have 4 new business revolving loans totaling just a little over $128,000. So I'll be going into detail, explaining a little bit about those loans, so you can see the great variety of businesses we're helping here and within the city. We did have 1 new rental residential rehabilitation loan of $95,000 for the renovation of 44 and 46 East Franklin Street. We have some photos we're going to share with you to show the rehabilitation work, which is truly fantastic. We've had no additional delinquency. In fact, good news, we did have 1 CDBG-funded delinquent account paid off in full this past fiscal year, so we were excited about that. And we also have multiple single-family rehabilitation loan applications in process that are just in various stages going into FY18 here. So our first business loan, I won't go into a whole lot of detail, but we did have the Gourmet Goat here on Potomac Street. We provided them with $10,000 to provide for new restaurant equipment, specifically a deli case. The next slide, we had a new business, the Pediatric Movement Center on Maryland Avenue. This loan helped to purchase gym equipment and therapy equipment needed for the center's pediatric clients. We also had a new business here within Mulberry Lofts, the Fades Away Premier Tattoo Removal Center. This was used to purchase equipment and provide working capital for it's an all-natural alternative to laser tattoo removal for those experiencing tattoo regret and maybe having difficulty obtaining employment.
Get that WED off.
We also have Lauren Brenneman. She has an established insurance agency previously located on Pennsylvania Avenue. She actually purchased the Valencia building located here on Potomac Avenue, and we helped to purchase and rehabilitate that with her. So we pride ourselves in the great variety of businesses we've been able to help here within the city.
Yes, and as you can also see in the presentation, the residential rental rehabilitation loan, this one actually fell under our blight elimination category, so this one does not have income restrictions. But this building has experienced, I think, actually 2 fires over the past roughly 4 or 5 years. And Freedom Equity LLC is the owner. As you can see, the previous photo has converted the building. I think there was 11 to 12 units in the property at one time. Now it is 6 units, all modern finishes, granite countertops, bamboo flooring, 6 nice units. We actually toured the property recently, so we're happy with how that project's turned out. I'm sure the owner is looking to get it rented as soon as possible. And then here at the end of our presentation, just once again, talking about some of our delinquent loans, and I think some of these would be familiar to some of our council members, that these are, once again, even some of the origination dates are older. The delinquencies occurred in roughly, I'd say, 2010 to 2013 period. And we also work with our finance department and city attorney on these loans. It sometimes becomes a matter of how much good money do we want to throw after bad. But with that being said, we end up writing the loans off through the finance department once, I guess, the city attorney and finance, we agree that these are uncollectible. We don't forgive the loans, but from an accounting perspective, they're written off as these will likely be a loss. But some of these loans still on this delinquent list, these are some of the notable ones with higher balances that were, once again, and I think in that last 5 to 6 year period of when they became delinquent. We still think there are some potential opportunities to collect on some of these. We actually did have a delinquent loan in fiscal year 17, which is the last slide. That was actually paid off in full, so that was a win for us there. In the coming months, we will likely be coming back to the Mayor and Council with some proposed edits of our business revolving loan fund guidelines. Most of those would be housekeeping guideline updates for that program. All of these loan programs, for the most part, unless they're very small loans, go through our Hagerstown Loan Review Authority for approval. I want to give credit to all of our Loan Review Authority members who have been very diligent about selecting loans in the last 4 to 5 years. We've even had some loans where we've assisted businesses, I think in maybe fiscal year 14 or 15, where although the business has since closed, because of the diligence of the HLRA with requirements on loan security, we've been able to still collect on those loans. And once again, we'd like to come back to the council probably sometime in the last quarter of 2017 to discuss some potential housekeeping updates to the guidelines, take out some things that are maybe outdated, and also within the guidelines have that delinquency collection process highlighted. So with that said, any questions?
I just,
All right.
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, last but not least, update on the rental licensing program.
Good afternoon. We were here last week, as you probably recall, with the HPD to talk about excessive use of city services ordinance as well as rental licensing. Last week, we mainly talked about rental licensing as the way it coordinates with excessive use. This week, we're back to just talk about the rental licensing program, give you an update on that. And so what we're gonna do is, I'm gonna run briefly through the memo that was in the packet, and then Paul is gonna make the presentation with the PowerPoint of all the data he's collected. He has an unusual ability to mine data regarding anything that we touch in our department. And so he's put together some information for you with rental licensing. But just as brief background for folks who are not familiar with the program, the city adopted a rental licensing program in 2003. The intent was to protect and promote public health, safety, and welfare, establish rights and obligations of landlords and tenants, and encourage landlords and tenants to maintain and improve quality rental housing, prevent deterioration of rental facilities, and support property values. Periodically, adjustments have been made to the code over the years. 2010, 14, and 16 come to mind. Currently, however, we have an annual license process, annual exterior inspections, and then interior inspections at tenant turnover, but no more than every 4 years. And so that's what we have. In terms of what kinds of properties are licensed, it's any structure that has rental units except owner plus one and Hagerstown Housing Authority properties. Not the Section 8, but the Hagerstown Housing Authority owned properties, because the feeling was their inspection standards were comparable to the city's. Then for what's excluded in the ordinance from the program are hotels, motels, bed and breakfasts, nursing homes, and hospitals. What are excluded by interpretation are homeless shelters due to their hotel-like transiency and the assumption of oversight by the state or other agencies, residential treatment facilities due to the on-site care and oversight by others, ARC of Washington County houses due to in-home nursing and other oversight, assisted living facilities due to their nursing care and other oversight. And in November of 2016, our department staff provided an update to the mayor and city council on housing provider properties that are in the community, which ones are in the program, which ones are not. And then we did some research to show whether or not their inspection standards are indeed similar to ours and what kind of outside oversight those that are not in the program are getting. And so we, at the time, provided some recommendations because there was concern expressed in city council that we have a catch of housing types in the community that are not owner-occupied, that don't get inspected or have the oversight to the same degree by the city as the rental properties. And so we were making some recommendations at that time about whether we should include the supportive housing provider properties, homeless shelters, residential treatment facilities, and dormitories, which kind of fell through the cracks. When we created the residential program, we didn't have any dormitories. Well, we do now on South Potomac Street across from the library. They're not in the program. So we made the variety of recommendations at the time. There was a change in administration, and then the PICR process began, which is the Permitting Inspections Code Compliance Review Committee, which is folks from the business community and from property management community and city council members and city staff that are to get together in an ad hoc basis for the course of 2017 to look at the permitting process and other issues felt desirable that by the code administration portion of planning and code administration touches on. And in fact, today we have members of the committee in the audience because they are very interested in the rental licensing program and whether revisions or whatever could happen to make it preferable for the property managers as opposed to how they feel it operates currently. So anyway, they're here to hear the presentation. And so anyway, we in the memo I provide you with a couple of recommendations. What I'm going to do is let Paul touch on those after he goes through the data he's collected for you.
So Kathy, to clarify, none of these recommendations, we didn't make any of those
No.
changes in the fall?
No, we stopped doing research and working on it with the change in administration where weren't sure whether there was still the interest in going down that path. And then the picker process began. We figured might as well go through picker and see what comes out of that before making changes.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so I'm just going to go through some data that you can kind of understand how the rental licensing program has been in existence and some of the information associated with it. Since 2010, we have had an increased number of rentals that have happened in Hagerstown just based on those charts. You can see that from 2010 to 2017, there's been an addition of 1,204 rental units into our community through the licensing that we license in Hagerstown. And not all of those are new construction. Actually, a very small percentage are new construction. These are homes that were either vacant or were owner at that point and then were bought by an investment property owner and turned into a rental property in our community. For some of you that might not know, as far as the zones go in Hagerstown, we have 6 licensing inspectors, and it's divided up through 6 zones in our town. And we basically take into account the number of structures and units that are in each of those zones, also the neighborhood first group boundaries. So we have one inspector that those neighborhood and groups would deal with so they know who to contact if they have a concern. Also our trash districts, so that we can not split trash districts. It makes it easier for everyone to know which areas trash enforcement needs to occur if their zone boundaries match up. And then also our number of parcels, because although we have a number of rental units and structures that we inspect through the program, we also have a number of parcels that we have to actually make sure they're maintaining to city standards as well. One of the questions that was raised last week is where are our owners? Where do our owners live that own rental property in Hagerstown? So 29% of our rental units that we license are owned by city residents. 23% of our rental units are owned by Washington County residents that do not live in the city of Hagerstown. 25% of those are ones that are owned by people that live in the state of Maryland. So they don't live in Washington County or city of Hagerstown, but they live in the state of Maryland. And then for Pennsylvania, we have 7%, Virginia is 7% as well, 2% West Virginia, and then we have 7% for the remaining of the country, and we have one owner that lives in Canada. So that's the breakdown of where do property owners actually reside at that own property in Hagerstown.
That 30%, are these figures for all rentals?
For the ones that are licensed in our program. So it does not include the housing authority. Just a density map to show where all of our rentals located at. So you can kind of see the darker red show where more rentals are at in our town, and then it gets lighter in colors is where it's a less dense rental population. So our downtown is of course in the center of the map there, so you can see where there's some density with those. And you'll see some darker spots in the outlying areas. Those are larger apartment complexes. The one to the center towards the right is the Bradford Apartments. Then the one above from that that's a darker dot is the Glen Haven Road and Security Road area, the Washington Gardens area. And then the one above that is Cortland. So they have a higher density because there's a number of concentration units there. Just some basic numbers on some of the inspections that we do. We have a proactive and concern notices that we issue out. So these are ones that the inspectors are riding around. We haven't gotten a call about it, but their weeds are 3 foot high in the property, or there's a pile of junk on the property, something along those lines. So those are the numbers that we've done over the years and what's projected for 2017. Then also the reported concerns. So these are the ones that people have actually called our office to report something on a property or to report a concern they have about something in their apartment unit. And then also the number of abatements that we have conducted. So those are ones that we issue a notice, but no one actually mowed or cleaned their property. So we stepped in as a city and did it ourselves.
What would you attribute to the ratcheting up of the proactive concern notices? You're jumping up more than 1,000 since 2013. I imagine if you went back further than that.
We added staff.
We added staff. The staff was doubled. We went from 3 inspectors to 6 inspectors. So we had 3 staff members covering a third of the city. Now we have 6 covering a sixth of it.
So were those numbers always escalating, or if you went back further, would the numbers be higher or lower?
One problem that we have on that is we did not have a computer system before that time period to really kind of look at it. We didn't start using Munis until 2013 for inspections. So that's as far back as I could go. But
Would
based
you
on
guys just like use slate and chalk, or?
yeah, pen and paper. So, but it's one of those that it's what you're able to observe while you're out in the field, essentially. So,
Did you add staff in 2013?
no, we added staff in 2015.
And before that, had you had more staff, like 2011, 2010?
2010, we reduced staff.
So in 2010, you reduced staff.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out, the correlation between reduction, proactive conditions, and, you know, that just that fluctuation in general.
Well, we would have had that issue with foreclosures in
Right.
that time period.
And from 2007 to 2010, roughly.
And we still have
Yeah.
a number.
Okay.
One of the misconceptions with our office is that we fine everybody. Everyone always says that the code office always fines you. But that is not the case. If you look at our numbers, the number of notices that we issue and the number of citations that we issue, in 2015, we fined 4% of the notices that were written. And so far in this year, we find approximately 2% of the notices that have been written. So very rarely does someone actually receive a fine. We try to work with everyone to gain compliance. We do not try to fine someone to gain compliance. And majority of those fines are actually through our abatements that we do, because through our ordinance, we're required to fine when we issue an abatement at a property. If we mowed their lawn, they're going to receive a fine as well, because they're being penalized for us having to do that. For rental exterior inspections, you can kind of see how the numbers have been over the years. And like we said, we changed the ordinance in 2015, and so the number of annual exterior inspections that occurred went up because we went from every 2 years to once every year for an inspection. But also we provided what are the top 10 violations that you see during the exterior inspections occurred at a property. It's common to see weed violations at a property, high weeds on a property, or also piles of rubbish or debris, discarded items on the property. And then, of course, then we have the other ones that kind of go through. I'm not going to read all of them, but you all can see where the percentages are for the notices. For interior inspections, you can see where our numbers have been. Approximately, we do about 800 a year. You can see that a couple dip below that, but approximately about 800 a year is how many interior inspections that we conduct. And the top violations that are found inside properties during a time period is electrical issues. That's found on 65% of the inspections that we go on. And then on there are smoke or carbon monoxide alarm violations on 53% of the properties that we go into. And in all honesty, the carbon monoxide is really a small percentage of that. It's mostly smoke alarms. A lot of times they're not in place, or they're in the wrong locations or the wrong type. And then interior surfaces is essentially damaged wall surfaces or floors that they have holes. And I'm not talking small holes like picture hanger holes. We're talking large holes that are in these walls or floors. And then some of the other ones as well, window conditions, plumbing systems and fixtures. That's actually where there's leaks in the plumbing fixtures, or they are not functioning properly, they don't have hot water. We actually had a couple where they didn't even have certain plumbing fixtures in the unit. So we've had those. We have mechanical equipment as well, or heating facilities where they're not functioning properly. And then also we have means of egress or emergency escapes where people have no way to get out of the building safely. We also have infestations. And then ventilation can be, at times it can be whether or not they're properly ventilated for the unit, or it can also be where the ventilation is for the dryer exhaust and that type of stuff, proper ventilation out of for those amenities. And then stairs, handrails, and guards, either they're missing or they're broken. The one thing that we reported back in late 2015 was that we did an Engage Hagerstown survey where it asked citizens to participate in a survey online to see what do they feel is the greatest impact to their neighborhood for an exterior code violation. So a majority of them were saying it was sanitation and high weeds and trash can storage, graffiti, and so on. And then since that time period, what has been our response to try to address those issues? Because these are ones that people typically do not call our office about, but they're ones that they would like to see stuff done in their neighborhoods. So our response since that time period, the number of notices that we've issued based on the percentages on the survey. So next we're going to go over a couple of recommendations that we have here. The one recommendation that we're looking into is amending the Chapter 197 to have it where we can actually lien the licensing fees. We do this with the vacant structure program, so it's not uncommon for us to do, but we don't have it in the rental program. Since 2010, we haven't collected over $10,000 in license fees. We've taken the people to court, and the judges have found in our favor for saying that they are not properly licensed, but we never collect the fees. We take them to court, we fine them, they get the fees assessed to them. The fines are liened, but the actual fee itself is never paid. So we have open invoices in our books going back for years, and some of these property owners have done this for the last 5 to 6 years. They're just not paid. One thing that we were looking at was exempting for any existing structure that renovates their property. Any property owner that renovates it to a PEP standard, that they would be exempt from the rental registration program for the first 4 years after the issuance of the certificate of occupancy. This is a way that we're getting higher quality of living, and also recognizing that to the owners taking that type of initiative to move forward with renovations to a higher standard than the minimum standard.
We currently provide that exemption for new construction.
Yeah, so it's only for entirely new built structure, but not for any existing renovated property. One of the things that when we were talking about coming here, we looked at all the other different programs in the state of Maryland. So some of the recommendations that we'll have here forward is things that other states or other jurisdictions do in the state that we do not do. So these are recommendations that we feel that are probably something to consider. There are, of the top 100 populous census designated places in the state of Maryland, 90 are governed by a rental licensing program. There are 6 counties actually that have a whole entire rental licensing program for their entire county. So just a quarter of the whole entire state's governed by rental licensing through their counties alone. When I reviewed those, you're looking at the inspections of when interior inspections are conducted at properties. And Hagerstown is very lenient as far as the inspection process goes in the interior of the properties compared to all the other jurisdictions that license rentals in the state of Maryland. We, like Kathy has mentioned, we have it where you do an inspection once every 4 years, but only at tenant vacancy. So if a property is inspected today and it doesn't become vacant for another 10, 20, or 30 years, we never do another inspection of that property until that time period passes. So it could be 10 years, 20 years from that inspection point that we would actually do an inspection during that time period. All the other jurisdictions that I reviewed, only 9 have a more lengthier time period out of the 90 that I looked at. So we rank 81st on our frequency of inspections.
Well, go back to your numbers in Maryland. 25% of Maryland jurisdictions as a total.
Counties,
Counties, 25% of the 20, how many counties are there?
24. There's
24.
6 counties out of 24 are licensed by a rental licensing program.
What about the other 18?
They have individual programs for municipalities. So let's say out of the corporations, the municipalities that are incorporated, out of the 18.
157 municipalities.
Well, I didn't go through all of them because I didn't have all that time. I looked at the most populous 100 municipalities in Maryland.
And places.
And places, like designated places through census tracts or corporations. 90 of the 100 are governed by rental licensing.
So that would include incorporated places like us, as well as the unincorporated places in places like Baltimore County.
Of similar urban size.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not going into to Prince George's and looking at the codes of every single one of those small jurisdictions that could really be one big jurisdiction.
Prince George's is licensed the whole entire county.
That's what I'm saying, though.
So they fall underneath the county code for licensing.
Yeah.
So they don't, there's a couple of jurisdictions in Prince George's that license their own, but then there's some other ones that have just used the county licensing program. So looking at their inspections and how often they do them, a number of jurisdictions do them on an annual basis, and a number of jurisdictions do it on a 3-year basis. And the one thing that we were looking at was inspecting interior property every 3 years. Reason being is that our program has been in existence for 14 years, and there are still 2,233 units that we have never been in that time period. And they have had turnovers. People just don't call us for those inspections.
So this is, you're proposing to go every 3 years regardless if there's tenant turnover or not?
Correct.
We're coming in every 3 years regardless?
Correct. Because that is what all the other jurisdictions do. We are the only jurisdiction in the state of Maryland that does it at a vacancy for a turnover. Everyone else does it on a regular basis, including our Section 8 properties.
With no ability other than we trust you to find out when there's actually a turnover.
What was that again? I'm sorry.
With no great ability outside of trusting the
Correct.
landlord
You're
to tell
relying
us when
on
there's a
self-reporting,
turnover,
so to
right?
speak. You're
Correct.
relying
So,
on-
so you have a person who owns a rental property, let's just say they have four apartments in the units. Let's say they live in one and they rent 3, okay? A tenant moves out, they come, we do an inspection, because they're following the law. And then that new tenant stays there for 10 years. You still want to go in 3 years and inspect that property.
Correct.
Yeah.
Why?
For a number of reasons for those, and I think Chief Laura could actually give a lot more information on that, but we need to make sure that they are not creating unsafe conditions inside those units. Unfortunately, we've responded to too many fires recently that has been unsafe conditions been created. We have hoarding situations, cleanliness situations, infestations, overcrowding, and these are things that we cannot identify when we're going into a property when they're vacant. We identify a number of rooms that are not allowed to be bedrooms because they don't have the proper egress or the proper windows to get out of the space, anything along those lines. We say they're not to be used as a bedroom. We find out that when the fire department responds, they were using it as a bedroom. People are sleeping in basements, people are sleeping in attics, and these are only after fires that we actually get inside those places to see those things. We need to get into more frequently to make sure that people are staying in a safe environment. And like I said, we're the only jurisdiction that does it at vacancies. So of those, it protects the property owners when the responsibility is being shifted. Because right now, a property owner can get fined for not properly reporting their turnovers. Whereas if we shift the responsibility to the municipality, no longer is that there is that threat out there of being fined for not reporting a turnover. The one thing we looked at that since 2013, there were 4,846 turnovers in the city of Hagerstown that we should have done inspections for. Of those, only 2,026 were inspected. So only 42% of them were properly and accurately reported to our department
How do you come up with that number? How did you know?
through our utility accounts.
Gotcha.
And I took a lot of deal working through those to make sure we took out the vacancies, when they're rolled over into non-payments, when the owner takes the name, we reported all those out of there.
Even if you were off 500.
Oh, I'm not challenging the number. I'm just
No,
curious
I'm
how
just
they work.
reiterating for him, even if you're off 500, you still missed 2,300, you know, so.
Right.
Yeah, there was over 1,000 properties during that time period, properties, not units, that didn't even report a single turnover.
So we got 9,300 rental units that you want to inspect once every 3 years with 6 people. Think that's plausible?
Yes. That's approximately 400 inspections annually to each inspector, which is doable.
Staggered, of course. Wouldn't try to get them all in one
Right,
year.
yeah, we wouldn't do first year, we wouldn't do all 9,000 one year. One of the other items that Kathy had mentioned that we presented back in November of 2016 was the licensing of nonprofit organizations that own or provide some sort of residential housing. This is kind of a recap of what's inspected. This was the last thing that we had presented. It was included in your packet of the places and number of beds that they provide. But what they currently inspect is like the cleanliness, lighting, egress, free from debris, bathroom and kitchen fixtures, that type of stuff. Things that they do not inspect is overcrowding, water heater safety, dryer duct safety, smoke and carbon monoxide alarm, surprisingly was not on these lists when we were looking at them. Proper ventilation, electrical hazards, water contamination. So, but this is kind of more or less just a follow-up from our November discussion and kind of seeing where we want to move forward on this whole entire licensing a nonprofit. I will say, researching these other jurisdictions, some do and some do not. So it's kind of split on those. One of the other things that coming across researching jurisdictions is that a number of them license hotels and motels. This is a common practice in a number of jurisdictions, actually. And it's also known, if you look at the rental percentage of what you have for rental units versus owner-occupieds in towns and jurisdictions, the ones that have the higher rental percentages typically license their hotels and motels as well, to ensure that we're having a safe area for people to live or to reside. Unfortunately, like as Kathy and I have come across here during our research, that we have some extended stay places that people are living at for longer periods of time and are staying in these hotels. We have some services in the area that are familiar with people that have resided for, of course, as few as 1 day at a hotel, but up to 3 years been living in the same hotel. So we have some residents that stay in a hotel for a very long time period. That we see that they're having unsafe conditions. They're storing milk outside because they have no refrigerator in their hotel room to make sure that they could provide that to their children that were in there for cereal in the morning. One of the things that that we've come and we've talked to some of these agencies that deal with people that reside in hotels is there's infestations of roaches and bed bugs and lice that they're bringing to locations. There's mold and sanitation issues. They don't have proper working equipment. They're overcrowding the rooms, and they're not meeting minimum living standards. So there's some dangerous situations that are out there for those.
I think you've identified some hotels that have that subpar standards currently within the city.
Unfortunately, we don't go into those hotels only on a complaint basis. We have identified some recently that have these types of conditions, but we only go on a complaint basis on those. So it's very rare we get in those.
How many hotel rooms are in the city that we're talking about?
I do not know. I don't know.
One of the problems, even if you get complaints about bed bug infestation, what can you do about it with the city? We have no licensing over them, right?
No, but they do have to follow to the property maintenance code, so it says no infestation of any insects in the property there. So we do hold them to accountable if we get complaints.
I mean, I think back when I was a caseworker and there was a row of hotel rooms that are no longer there on the dual highway that were clearly not hotel rooms. I mean, that was clearly a single-story apartment complex, and used as such with individuals that would, use the hot plate for a stove and created just as equally unsafe conditions. And there was, the only care from the hotel was, making sure the rooms were full, not the condition of the space.
Right. So,
This is a tricky item in terms of, perhaps making differentiation between extended stay hotel situations and the typical transient hotel situations. And then the other issue is if we discourage this type of allowing hotels to operate as homeless shelters as like an emergency stopgap, if that's gone, what happens to the people that need that stopgap? So it's a tricky one to deal with, but at the same time, some people are not living in safe conditions. I mean, what would be the alternative? Where would folks go? But anyway, we are concerned about what we've been hearing about what some families are living in because they have no other choice, but at the same time, it's not safe.
Yeah, but then these hotels that operate in that manner then get around the rules that these other landlords are subject to, like the lease law. Suddenly, they get to stay week to week and month to month and in conditions that are even less because basic livable facilities are less. I mean, they're not meant to function in that type of permanent capacity. If a hotel wants to construct it in that manner, then sure, it should do so, and if it did so, then it would operate, under those rules anyway. So if it wants to function that way, it should be subject to the rules that way. I guess I just continue to get back to this notion that, any place that functions as that rented, for that rented residential purpose should have to comply consistently. And it doesn't matter whether it's, the different functions in which we've seen a place like the Dagmar, function where entities are placing people, you know what I mean? And then it's also taking in people and, offers as a hotel or the smaller
That's a
unit
good
places
example.
elsewhere.
The Dagmar, is that something that currently is or is not under a licensing program? It's not.
It is,
It is.
because it is operated as a rooming house, it's not operated as a hotel.
And it's always been.
It always has been in the program.
And we've inspected all those units.
We have in the last couple of years, and we have a regular meeting with the owner. He's pulled permits to renovate certain areas and to bring it up to a standard. We're working through it slowly, unfortunately, but we are working through the building to gain compliance.
And I'm curious to know, and Kathy, I appreciate what you've said about, well, where are these people going to go if we don't allow substandard housing for them? So one of my curiosities would be, how many of these substandard places exist outside of the municipal boundaries of Hagerstown where these people are being placed? Because it seems to me that what we're doing is just encouraging this type of housing in our city, and I don't see it going anywhere else. I could be wrong. I mean, maybe they have this type of housing in Williamsport and Boonesboro and Smithsburg and Hancock, and I could be.
Well, I'm sure they have a proportionate share.
I'm curious to know what proportionate share they have, and I don't know if we could ever get that, but I have the feeling that we have a greater share, is my best guess.
I would think so, number-wise for sure, just because he's a.
Well, I think sheer volume,
Yeah,
yeah, but.
volume's gonna be a lot more.
But I know you're talking about percentage-wise per capita,
right.
and I think we still have substantially more. I could be wrong about that.
I guess it would depend on the dynamic of measure that you're looking at. Sheer rentals, are you talking about that? Are you talking about different forms of?
I'm talking about the placements that we're talking about here.
Of
Placements.
subsidized housing, you're talking about, placement of facilities.
Right, versus.
Which one of those components, are we comparing to? If it's those type of places specifically,
That's what I'm talking about.
then I would say, yeah, we probably have more.
Yeah,
And we
that's-
probably have more than we are aware of. I mean,
That's what I'm talking about, Kristen, specifically that.
And,
And also, with non-transients, You know, with the big brouhaha that occurred with all of us a month or so ago about some individual claiming they were jogging and saw some drug activity, we all know what I'm talking about. I learned a lot of things about at least one motel in Hagerstown that I did not know. And I'm not going to repeat that, but there also seems to me that if we're going to have hotels in Hagerstown, that anybody who is coming in from outside of our town and wanting to stay in a hotel in Hagerstown should be quite aware that it's meeting minimal standards. Unlike, for instance, the Holiday Motel that existed for how long, it had any standards it wanted. So I also don't have a problem with that. That, you know, when we talk about finding Hagerstown an inviting place, I don't think we've had this problem for a long time, but a number of years ago, we started getting complaints from people who were flying into the airport about the cabs. The first introduction they got to Hagerstown were cabs that were unlike anything they had ever seen before. And we don't need the same thing with hotels in Hagerstown either, or to find that we attract a lower end of a hotel.
What I guess my big questions, I know it briefly got discussed in our last picker meeting, I'm sure we'll get into it more, is throughout the, I guess, the process of the rental licensing, has there been a known improvement that could be quantified within the housing stock or the you know, taxable base, what have you? Or are we just kind of treading water? And then, you know, each year, I mean, yeah, we see some more places here, but is really anything being accomplished?
Well, the one thing to look at is that there's a minimum standard, and everyone has to meet the minimum standard. If you want to see the housing of quality improve to a significant level, you need to raise your minimum standard and raise your minimum property maintenance code standards. Are the places that were being inspected meeting the minimum standard? Yes. Once we find those, once we identify the areas that are not meeting the minimum standard, they're bringing them up into quality.
I think that goes back a lot to what Councilman Alshar has pointed out many times, I think it's being discussed here now, that if this is gonna be what we're gonna have, it needs to be fair and consistent across the board. Because right now, it seems to be very punitive to the individual property owner who's trying to abide by the rules. Because that's all we're going into, is the guy who's calling us and telling us, hey, I'm having tenant turnover, or come inspect me, which is great for those people, but that's, I think, then alludes to what Councilman Messer indicated, as far as we have this whole other area of housing that is sub-quality, substandard, that is, in essence, attracting, you know, this level of you know, residents, what have you, that are leading to some of these issues. So, I mean, I think what you guys are saying, that these purposes, I think we're all on the same page as far as we're gonna have. It needs to be consistent. I mean, if we're gonna have, you know, private homeowner, it still needs to be. I mean, everything that she listed, at least these nonprofits. I think Hagerstown Housing Authority should be in there. The hotel. I mean, if we're gonna be fair, let's be fair across the board, and then work with ways to make it, you know, the best, you know, for everybody.
And also, the question you asked is a good question about has there been improvement, and the program's been in existence again for how many years?
2003.
Yeah, so
14 years, actually.
I have to tell you, sitting here after seeing it for 14 years and realizing that at bare minimum, a quarter of our rental units have never even been looked at, to me, is a failure in the program. It's not your problem, it's our collective problem for
Or we've
deciding.
had 25 turnovers that we
Yeah,
didn't.
for deciding to
Right,
do
I
it
don't know
this
about
way,
that.
it's, yeah, if you're gonna tell, so we're again fall back into this very problem that so many landlords came and complained to us about at the very inception of this program. And it's one reason it ended up this way is, you know, why do you penalize us, the good landlords? And the problem is we have now, in trying to do it that way, my guess is that when we find the reality, that we're gonna find a lot of the bad landlords are that 25%. I could be wrong, but I think to have, after all these years, only 75%, and that, I think, is optimistic when we say 75%, because again, that involves believing everybody is registered. So I like what your recommendations are.
So, Let me get this straight. You want to go to a program where every rental unit is inspected, once every 3 years, interior. Okay. Now, if we went to that program, would we still expect, let's just say I have a rental property and somebody moved in, I had my inspection done, somebody moved in, they moved out in 6 months, somebody else moved in, would I expect to get inspected again?
Not by this recommendation or anything, it would be once every 3 years.
Once every 3 years, okay, that's what I was trying to get to.
Now, some jurisdictions have it that way, where they inspect every 3 years and at every turnover.
Here's my question, because I was trying to figure out the math, and I can't. 93 rental units in the city of Hagerstown, 6 inspectors. And you said the number was what, per inspector per year?
Increases would be about 400, because we're taking out some ones that we're not going to get, some complaint calls, because people call us when they have problems inside their units. And then also, you take out the ones that we're doing for turnovers right now, because we wouldn't be doing those.
Right.
We would be replacing those with the ones. So let's do
Yeah, I'm
simple
at like
math.
$550 a year per inspector.
So, well, yeah, because you're taking out some of those ones and stuff there. So
And I'm
if you're-
trying to figure, okay, $550 a year per inspector.
If you do, let's just break it down simple math. You have 9,000, 3 years is 3,000 a
Right.
year, with 6 inspectors is 500, but you're reducing those, let's say, 1,000 by 6, so then you're taking out 200 and some, so down to 300 in some inspections. It was 381 was the exact number, is what I projected to be the increase for each
So you're looking at
inspector.
probably 1.5 per, like on a per day basis for each work
Be
day.
2.5 on a workday.
2.5, okay.
Do you feel comfortable?
No, 2.5 additional inspections. per
Inspections, yeah,
inspector
2.5 inspections
to go
per
through all
day
the units.
per inspector.
And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I guess what I think you're alluding towards is, would it be an issue where we're looking to have to add more staff, more expense, more of those things? Because I think the mayor's going towards.
I mean, considering that the
Right.
discussions at budget time was,
Right.
you know, how do we reduce that cost of personnel and not add cost of personnel?
But you seem very confident to be able to do it with the same personnel.
Even if we add hotel, motels.
Well, then you're gonna have different licensing fees and stuff like that you all would have to decide to see if it would be able to support a person, but that's something that we could certainly absorb. We have a neighborhood services program specialist inspector that does stuff that, it could be something to look into, that you might only need a part-time one to help with, but it would all depend on how many we have, how
Well, I
many
think that
units
you're-
there are, and that type of stuff.
I think two things. One is, I think that if that were the case and you added that, it would be self-supporting, number one. But number two, I think that you need somebody, if that is the route we're going, for adding those types of units which come with their own special sets of criteria and circumstance as it applies to state and federal regulatory criteria and protections and all those. I think it's got to be somebody that's specialized in those components of hotels and motels and rooming houses and boarding houses. I just don't think you're gonna be able to throw that into the mix of somebody's route, so to speak, and make that applicable. I could be wrong, it could be easier than I'm thinking, but I would just venture that somebody's going to have, or at least somebody within that department's gonna have that greater knowledge depth as it applies to the intricacies that exist in that arena that doesn't obviously exist in your basic private market.
Have we had people lose their rental licenses throughout this program?
As a revocation? No. I mean, we revoked them years ago, but we found they were still operating. It was only a fine. So revoking was not a good business decision on the city standpoint, because we were.
Being is that there's not an opportunity for enforcement, so to speak, or I guess?
No, we revoked their license. They still operated as a rental facility, and then the only repercussion is a fine. And then they just would pay the fine and not license and
that's
not
gonna
be
be
part of
the
the
challenge.
program.
Yeah, because I guess you can't disconnect the utility to the space.
When the ordinance was passed in 2003, we said we would not evict anyone or would displace the tenants for the property owners' ability not to properly license their properties. So we're not penalizing the tenants.
So what would be the repercussion then, I guess, if we go into these substandard units where you have somebody who's not conforming and they're not, you know, they're the quote-unquote bad landlord? What can we do other than fine them, but they're not gonna pay the fine anyways, or, I mean?
We don't pay a fine, it gets liened or assessed against your property, but with this last administration, we gave ourselves, through the code office, the ability to abate code violations now, so we have some funding sources to be able to start abating code violations at properties to get things into compliance. Before, we only would mow people's lawn. Now we're gonna be able to fix roofs, fix certain issues that are
So
going
explain that
on.
process, you put an abatement on it,
But
We would have to go to court and use one of the other chapters of the code.
I want to make sure we're all on the same sheet of music. You know, when we've been talking abatements throughout the years, we're talking about abatements on vacant structures usually. Now, you're talking about we're actually abating on residential property. When we do a residential inspection, they're not in compliance, and the landlord, if they don't comply, we come in and abate it? Is it?
The ability is there, we don't do it currently, but the practice, council member Corbin was asking about, what would we do if someone didn't follow the
I mean, I think that's
regulations?
the question though, what are you gonna, I mean, if we're not gonna remove the tenant,
No, I think
and we've identified the unsafe condition, and obviously staff has the ability to determine unsafe condition of a degree that means, you know, it's unsafe for living condition of the tenant. I don't know what other choice you have if you're not going to remove the tenant and shut the unit down.
I think it's basically, if push comes to shove, you come to that.
I mean, you're
What do you
sitting
do?
there
That's
saying,
what
you
you
know,
do. That's what you do.
65% of the violations are associated with electrical, and obviously, I'm sure there's some huge wide gambit of just what that means, you know, where, you know, one might be GFIs in the bathroom, and another one might be, you know, look, you got the paper, or you got the place, you know, wired to catch fire tomorrow. You know, I assume you look at that and go, if you're not gonna remove the tenant from that condition.
I strongly
You know,
suggest that when
do
we.
you have the fire company show up, like they did, the Antietam Street, 2 years ago? Was it East Antietam, or, I don't know, wherever Labor's is in.
Yeah, East
Baltimore.
Yeah, Baltimore, and, you know, that, you know, you have a condition like that around.
I certainly think that when you give us a presentation of recommendations, ultimately, that it should include, so to speak, as they say in NCAA terms, the death penalty. I mean, I'm not encouraging us to apply it, but I think if there ultimately isn't the ability to say, you can't continue to lease the structure and we will cut off the
There's gotta be an
utilities or
endgame.
whatever.
There's gotta be some teeth to it,
There's
otherwise-
gotta be. If there's not, it becomes a joke.
Yeah, you're like, hey, your roof's leaking, hey,
We
your
already
roof's
said.
leaking.
Yeah,
hey,
we're
your
gonna
roof's
fine you,
leaking.
we're not gonna pay the fine, yeah, I just
Keep
think.
renting to this person, your roof's leaking, it's not a
Right.
big
Right,
deal.
and the person's still in the substandard condition.
Right, right.
And
It
as
just
you said
can't be
before,
like that.
maybe not that person, but they throw that person up, and then they attract a whole new individual who will live in that.
I mean, that's the
substandard.
whole idea
And you
of,
sit there and scratch your head and go, I wonder why nobody's buying that house right next to that one that's, you know, in that condition. You just, I don't know how much longer you know, you can exist in that manner and wonder why your assessable base is declining.
Right.
well, and I appreciate what you all are telling us, and clearly, there's no misunderstanding. This all is the continuation of the ups and downs with elected officials trying to reach that balance of
And-
not being too obtrusive, in the same respect, trying to achieve a goal.
And I think a good-
we have failed in our effort to be not as obtrusive.
Well, I think a good reflection of that, though, is at the inception of this code, you know, rental registration at its inception, I was a bit surprised to hear the numbers of, you know, 90 out of 100, because I can tell you that when we had that discussion at the inception of this, you know, 12 or 13 years ago, it was, hey, you're one of, you know, few going this route of registration. It wasn't, you know, you're sort of like going from ahead of the curve you know, and against the grain of opposition in that industry to now being sort of with or behind the curve.
You're right. Exactly.
Of the way that that's went.
We were leaders, now we're followers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what's happening.
Well, hopefully also when we come back with some of these recommendations, we'll take some insight from the bigger committee as well. Because obviously, people on that committee are some of the people that we call, you know, the quote-unquote good landlords that have made some great investments in our community. I mean, for example, that property I think you showed on East Franklin Street, not you, but Jonathan showed. I mean, that's what we want. I mean, that's what
Right.
you want to take a 10-unit or 12-unit burnt-down building and turn it into a, you know, high-end housing. I mean, that's phenomenal. That's what we need.
And for us, it can't be just that's what we want, because I agree that, you know, that's the result you're trying to achieve. I think it has to be, and we don't want what it was
Agreed.
continuing to exist next to it.
Right.
Because it'll never have success
Right.
in that reinvestment effort if we say, great job, you know what, the place beside it can continue to exist in the manner that it exists.
Which goes back to the consistency, I think,
Yeah.
that you stressed.
Yeah.
It's got to be consistent across the board.
Otherwise, it's, it's one fixed up structure in an oasis of, you know, decline around it, and it just can't be that way.
The only other thing that we had on here, I'm pretty sure, I can't remember now, of the different things that people license underneath their rental licensing program is the non-residential spaces. These are commercial spaces that people put out for lease as well, that they are governed in a number of jurisdictions as well, that they generally are finding fire safety issues, non-functioning bathrooms, electrical hazards, that type of stuff, that people are renting these commercial spaces but not having minimum living or minimum standards for occupancies for commercial use purposes. I think that was it, yeah.
I think the difficulty on the commercial side for me at this moment is you should be aware of it. I mean, commercial turnover should be much more glaringly apparent than tenant turnover. So that's the part I struggle with, is that, you know, a commercial entity as it, you know, changes, even within that commercial, you know, business place, you know, if you got a shopping center and it changes from, you know, a pizza joint to, you know, an office, you know that. I mean, you know, that's a very apparent thing that occurs.
And we do have a protection in place, even though we don't license commercial spaces. And the CCMU Downtown Zoning District, when a storefront, when someone comes in for a zoning certificate, if it's a change in use, we require an inspection to make sure that certain basic standards are met. And so we are, even though we don't have a program in the downtown where we anticipated that we might have a disproportionate number of substandard commercial spaces, we do have that process so that at least we're getting in there, and even if they have egress problems or whatever, that's being dealt with.
And don't get me wrong, I know some of it is a slippery slope. We talked a little bit last week about, I was fortunate enough to go with you guys around some places, and I thank you for that opportunity, of when there absolutely needs to be a standard, but there's also that tenant accountability, so to speak, where, you know, I think what you say, you can live poor but live clean, or there was some sort of analogy that you said or whatnot, because like, you talk about infestation that one property went into, had some glaring issues, but at the same time, some of the issues they're pointing out is just filth that they're living in just because they have no, you know, whether it's self-respect, self-esteem, what have you, a level of standard of their own. So that's the
What some
tough
of these
part.
fire issues have been. It
Exactly.
haven't been the landlords, it's been the tenants.
Right.
And so that's the other thing, you're exactly correct, Paul. It's important not to just make it out like landlords are a problem and tenants aren't.
Correct. I met with the housing authority and we went over some of the things, as I asked them, you know, you inspect the units while they're occupied. What do you feel as challenges and hurdles? And we went through some of those, but the one thing that the housing authority has is that they have tenant responsibilities that they're responsible for during their inspections, and then they have things that the landlords are responsible for. And these are things that we can certainly work through as well as our office, because like you just pointed out, the different things with cleanliness, hoarding situations, infestations, these are things that are created by the tenants and not by the property owners.
And we had that very discussion last week at the Housing Authority, at our board meeting, and I brought up, and said to them very fairly, you know, if I could, I would turn the entire Section 8 program, and I didn't realize that the Housing Authority didn't administer all Section 8 vouchers within the city, that they do a portion. And I said very flatly that, you know, if I had the ability, I would hand all of that over to them immediately, because they have executed and have the authoritative ability to manage units even more greatly than what you're proposing here, even to the degree that they have the ability for removal. Much more expeditiously than a private landlord, for tenant accountability, and for non-return. And, you know, try, and I said to them, you know, if you have an individual that creates some circumstance in which they're not permitted to return to any of those housing choices that the Housing Authority administers, and they go out and find another location, then that immediately places the susceptibility of that private landlord, under the disadvantage of not knowing that has occurred. And obviously, they don't have the ability to share that information, but I think that's a question that the Landlord Popular Association got to at one point was, you know, how do you have that you know, how are you able to share that information? And while I don't think that they can, I think that's an important component of the communication.
What was their
that
response when that question was presented?
Well, I mean, you have certain specific protections, I'm sure, that exist for individuals, you know, in any of those
No, I meant
cases.
more so along the lines of the housing authority, because right now I'm assuming what you're alluding to, they are responsible for the Section 8 subsidies that are within their own entities right now.
That's right.
Right, so when you presented that question of having them basically hand over all Section 8 subsidized vouchers within the city under
don't
their
have-
purview.
Because there's other entities within the city that I guess manage their own. I think Bethel is maybe an example.
Well, yeah, probably a lot of these nonprofits are.
Yeah, and so what I'm saying is, while an individual may create a circumstance in which they're prohibited from returning to a Hagerstown Housing Authority administered residential unit, they don't share that information with those other
Right, so then they
entities,
just go down to the next guy.
nor the private market, so
Right.
to speak, so that there is that sharing of knowledge base. But they do have the ability to say, you know, you can go anywhere else you want, you just can't come back
Come
to
here.
any of the
I agree, I
residential
think that's
spaces that we
what Councilman
administer.
Munson
And
alluded to
that's-
last week with some of the
and that's-
crime-free stuff, is having that information available.
I mean, I think that's great in theory, and this idea of tenant accountability. I'm sure the landlords would appreciate that, but how do you enforce that? I mean,
I
how do
don't-
we
well,
enforce it?
oh, I
We
don't-
can't tell a landlord who they can and cannot rent to.
No, I'm not looking for enforcement at all, but let's take the individual that I guess was recently, the article about the individual and the heroin and selling it out of Potomac Towers or whatever, you know, a few weeks ago.
It won't be
So,
repeated.
so there's an individual that likely, however that circumstance, let's say it plays out and the individual, you know, is guilty or whatever, Housing Authority says, okay, that individual's not permitted back in any of the units that we directly oversee or any of the ones that we administer on the Section 8
So some sort of
process.
database.
Yeah, so then that individual's gonna go and they're gonna find private landlord X, and they could possibly give private landlord X, you know, hey, call Jim Smith as my reference. Well, Jim Smith doesn't have to be, a valid reference, and that information sharing won't occur, and that individual will find something, you know, within the private, availability, that then just sort of perpetuate that issue. And frankly speaking, I think that's some of the reason that I continue to believe that there has to be an increased level of communication between the Housing Authority, the city, the private rental entities, and the residential living facility entities, because I mean, I've been
Those bouncing
to the coalition meetings where they plainly say an individual get into a place, get out of that place in 4 or 5 months, aren't eligible for local housing units, so they'll find a place with private and may not be the best conditions. these livable conditions we're talking about, or may not be the most responsible landlord, and then just that cycle then perpetuates itself. And that's, I guess, a level of communication that I think we need to have if we want to generate a higher, standard of living that we want to see.
Okay, any other questions?
Thank you all. Good job.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Fascinating statistics.
One thing, can I only say one thing? I met with Sean Griffith last week from the Hagerstown Housing Authority, and unless I misunderstood what he said, which I'm sure the chief could check on this for me, if a person, like the person at Potomac Towers that we were talking about, is found guilty and kicked out of public housing through the Hagerstown Housing Authority, which uses Section 8 vouchers, they are not eligible for a Section 8 voucher anyplace else.
That the housing authority administers.
I don't know if that's not what he said to me.
And and what I got from the meeting was that if it's a completely separate entity that manages,
They get their voucher, just go over to.
then they go through the
Well,
channels of that.
then that would
entity.
be on the land, and now we have landlords out here in the audience, and I know, at least the ones that I see out here, do background checks, through probably case search, if nothing else, and be able to see if an individual was charged with a crime and found guilty or no processed or whatever was done to them, in order for them to lose their public housing assistance at Hagerstown Housing Authority. Then, the landlord, then it's on him whether or not he takes an individual like that.
And I agree, and we get the reports every week, and, the articles in the Herald, and I send you guys that stuff and say, hey, this person was living over here and, 18 months ago. And so clearly that isn't occurring, to the degree that
I think the
that it
disconnect
should
is
be.
what Bob says, these landlords out here, they care about their properties.
Right.
They
They're
care
doing-
about
For
the
the
people
ones that
living in
don't,
properties.
we can't enforce that. I
Well,
mean,
sure,
if
no, we go back to what we just talked about there.
Yeah,
When you
it's
have
like-
issues like that,
I mean,
there's gotta be,
someone wants
exactly,
to let
there's
someone
gotta be an end
felons live in
game.
their house, we can't tell them otherwise. That's why I'm saying, how do you enforce
No,
that?
you
Like,
can't tell landlords.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't think you do.
No,
I'm
you
saying-
gotta hope that.
But I'm saying there's
you
a
gotta
contingent
hope
out there that
landlords
wants
are
that
doing
info,
what
and so they gotta
landlords
figure out a way
need to do.
to provide it.
Like the ones that sit out here in the
Well,
audience.
sure, well, listen, the
No, I
crime,
agree
crime-free
with that, but I
program
don't
we
think
have
that's the problem.
solves that
That's-
problem. It's just
Oh,
a
yeah.
matter of
Lose their-
landlords.
Well, eventually.
It's a matter of landlords wanting to be involved with it. That's what I mean.
But how far are we willing to go? Because we just said we haven't revoked any rental licenses. Some of the crime-free ordinance, I mean, it's a very small percentage of what we really actually are willing to
Right.
sink our teeth into. So, I mean, to me, until we get serious with that and have it across the board, we're just gonna be sitting there spinning our wheels for, the years to come.
All right. Thank you guys very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
City Administrator.
Nothing this evening.
Luke?
Thank you. I'll pontificate for a minute, so you all just have to put
I
up with
can't
it.
wait.
Yeah, well, it's gonna happen. Given what's happened in our country, and what seems to me to be that unfortunately we're in a nation today where the leadership is from the bottom up instead of the top down, I feel compelled to say something, so I will. And I want to start off with a little history lesson, if I can, and it'll be brief. But a history lesson of what it was like to be Jewish in 1930s Germany and try to attend a service in a synagogue. What you would expect would be to have armed Nazis outside of your synagogue. A synagogue in the 1930s Germany who had the audacity to hold their services undoubtedly would take their Torahs and their sacred objects and remove them from the synagogue in fear of what the Nazis would do. They would expect to have armed Nazis outside. You would expect to have Nazis marching in front of your synagogue, doing the Sieg Heil and blood and soil. And one day people said never again. The problem is what I just described wasn't 1930s Germany. It was 2017 Charlottesville, Virginia on Saturday. And to add to that, we should add to that a police force that refused upon request to even have an officer in the vicinity to observe what was going on. Too many people that I know, including our president, wants to equate one side with the other because he says and others say they came for violence and decry the violence. Well, quite candidly, I'm not here to decry the violence. What happened was horrible. I'm here to decry the concept, the fact that anybody in this nation could find anything to say about the Ku Klux Klan, the American Nazi Party, the white nationalist, and do anything except say they are subhuman individuals that should not exist and do not have a place in this nation. That's the only thing you can say about them. When you start saying, oh yeah, but the other side came and they came looking for violence, my answer to you is I don't care. They weren't the side that came preaching hatred. Yeah, did the other side bring some sticks with them? Yeah, they did. Again, the difference is when Westboro Baptist Church goes places, the only thing you ever hear is what animals they are. And there's never discussion about the other side that's out there protesting against them, because unlike the KKK and the Nazis, Westboro Church only brings horrible thoughts, but not violence. So somehow or another, when the KKK and the Nazis come with violence in their mind, along with the hatred in their hearts, and the other side shows up, we can start talking about some sort of equivalency, because all we talk about is people wanted to come and cause trouble. And that's not the fact. And again, Westboro Baptist Church is a good example that I would give to anybody. I know of nobody who would ever say one good thing about them when they show up at our veterans' funerals and say it's great. But you know, there's never any violence. There's people that would love to cause violence when they show up. We know it. They've been in Hagerstown. And it doesn't happen. So those who want to find some way of equating the people who came to protest against these subhuman idiots, I say to you, stop it. Start addressing the fact that these people should not exist in our society. And quite candidly, people can talk First Amendment all day long. I'm a member of the American Civil Liberties Union. I have been on their board of governors, and I got to tell you, marching with weapons in front of a synagogue and threatening to burn the place down is not free speech, and it should not be allowed. And they're not welcome here, and we all know we have a KKK presence in our community. It's been here for a long time. We've seen them in Sharpsburg. We've seen the leaflets that they put on our homes and our cars. And the last thing I'll say, and this will probably insult a whole lot of people, but I don't care. For my friends of color, I know it. Those who want to drive around our communities in their pickup trucks flying a Confederate flag and want to say they're not racist, they may not think they're racist, but I'll tell you what, there's a whole lot of people out here that define them as racist, and I am one of them. So if you want to fly your Confederate flag and talk to me about it, don't waste your time. So that's my rant for tonight, Mayor.
Thank you, Lou. Paul?
Well, I had some concerns with some at the planning commission, but I'm gonna table those for another time and just agree with what, Councilman Mester said there. Couldn't say it any better. Thank you, Paul.
Kristen?
I don't have anything.
Emily?
I was
You're not
gonna
going to
go-
stop me, Kristen, and come back, are you?
No.
Okay, Emily?
I was gonna go on a very similar rant, Lou, but I don't feel good, and you summed it up perfectly, so thank you. And the only other thing is, I hope to see everyone this Saturday at the downtown slide.
Oh, that's right, it's a Saturday.
It is.
That's right. Let's try to figure out how to get there.
Mayor got the opening slide. You get the first run?
I don't know if I do or not.
I wonder a picture of a couple years ago, David going down that thing the first year.
I would say geysers were down,
Didn't he-
so
he-
we're all gonna come and watch
It was him and like a mayor of like Chambersburg or something,
Yes, it was
The guy from Greencastle or
somewhere.
Chambers.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, I won't be doing that. But anyway, thank y'all. Have a good night.
Thank you, Bob.